everybody. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Go ahead and take your seats. I think people might still keep trickling in, but we want to make the most of this time. Hi, my name is Anna Han. I'm the Director of Judicial Clerkships in the Career Development Office at Berkeley Law. I think I saw some of you earlier at the CDO presentation. For those of you who don't know, the Career Development Office supports students and alumni seeking summer employment and post-grad employment at any point in your law school career or after. You can feel free to use our office. I support students specifically looking for summer judicial externships and postgraduate judicial clerkships. So judicial clerkships are typically 1 or 2 year postgraduate opportunities working in the chambers of a judge. And you can do a clerkship at any level of federal or state court. Today, we are delighted to welcome 2 alums who have clerked at various levels, including the United States Supreme Court, as well as a faculty member who clerked at the US Supreme Court and serves on our faculty clerkship committee. Our clerkship committee is involved in clerkship programming and is really intended to serve as a liaison between faculty, students, and the Career Development Office to help meet our students' clerkship needs. So to go ahead and get started, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, where you work now, where you clerked, and where you went to college and or grew up. And we'll start with Professor Kerr.
Where I grew up? That's,
Sure.
All right.
We have people from all over.
I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, now known as Joe Biden country. He lives actually like a half mile from where I grew up. I've been a professor here at UC Berkeley for 5 years, taught at 2 other law schools before this. And I'm usually in this room standing at the lectern teaching criminal procedure, so it's nice to be here with a different group. And I've been on the clerkship committee on and off as a member of the faculty. And my favorite ice cream is pistachio. Am I supposed to say something like that? I don't know, something like that. I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Linda Lai. I graduated proud alum from '99. I had contracts in this very room, although as I was commenting earlier, it was a little bit less fancy. We didn't have as nice chairs back then. I'm currently the general counsel for the California Environmental Protection Agency. I clerked for Judge Guido Calabresi on the Second Circuit, and looking forward to going back to a reunion for him later in April. I also had the honor of clerking for Justice Ginsburg, whose birthday actually was just a few days ago. So happy to be able to honor her.
And my name is Fein. I grew up here in the Bay Area. I went to Berkeley as an undergrad and came back for law school. And I clerked for Judge William Fletcher on the Ninth Circuit, who's also still teaching here, and Judge Judith Rogers on the DC Circuit, and then for Justice Kagan at the Supreme Court. And I'm currently now a senior counsel for litigation strategy at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Great, thanks. And I should say that we have some planned questions, but I hope to leave some time for questions from the audience as well. So our first question for our Berkeley Law alums: why did you choose to come to Berkeley Law?
Okay, I'll be honest, I had a rent control department in Berkeley. So I did want to stay local. I went to Yale as an undergrad, and I really wanted to go to a public law school. And Berkeley Law really stood out for me as the law school that sort of embodied what it means to have public education and access. And I was just really thrilled that it overlapped with the rent control situation.
I was living on the East Coast at the time that I was applying to law school, and I came and visited in the spring and was reminded by weather like this at how incredibly gorgeous and wonderful it is to live here in the Bay Area. So that was part of it. The other 2 parts were I sort of knew I wanted to get into environmental law, and I was very impressed by the program that the school had, sort of supporting students who were interested in that, as well as fellow students who were also in a local alumni community that were very active in that field. So it felt like a good place for that. And then the last thing I would put my finger on is I was not eager to sort of enter what would feel like a competitive environment or an environment of people sort of competing for things. I wanted to enter a place where it was sort of for the academic, intellectual curiosity to hone that and to feel sort of supported and not not anything other than sort of a supportive community. And when I came here, and my impression of the school, and then my experience when I was here was fully supportive of that. And when I keep talking to people who are still here now, it sounds like the school has kept up that that culture here, which was really key to my decision and really, I think, was instrumental in sort of me having a successful and good time here as a student.
Absolutely, I definitely think that's still the case. Continuing along the lines of, like, when you came to Berkeley Law, what types of things did you get involved in, and what did you do during your 2 summers?
Sure. One of the things I did not come in expecting to do this, but I knew I wanted to do environmental law, and there was a negotiations competition that sort of turned around the international negotiations of the climate treaty. At the time, it was sort of lead up to Copenhagen, and so I ended up joining a negotiations team. And my 1L spring, we qualified for the finals, so we flew to Copenhagen to participate in sort of mock international treaty negotiations for the climate protocol at the time, which was something that was sort of beyond my dreams or expectations coming in. Other than that, I worked for some of the student journals here. So I did both the environmental journal and then also worked in the law review and ended up, taking on a leadership role there, both of which were great opportunities. And then I also was a research assistant for, I think, at least 2 different professors. My 1L summer, or my summers, I spent 1 summer at the Sierra Club, and then my 2nd summer I split between the U.S. State Department in D.C. and a sort of small boutique environmental firm here in the Bay Area called Shoot Mahaly and Weinberger.
The activities are slowly rolling back to me. I did do law review as well as the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law. I went to law school wanting to be a labor lawyer, and because I think it cuts across a broad issue of, economic justice, cuts across a broad issue of swath of society, and found the ideal firm that I wanted to work for. And one of the partners there happened to be married to Andrea Peterson, who was my first year property law class. And so I just remember hearing, I don't know if anyone here had Professor Peterson, or if she's already gone emeritus by the time you all took her, but she would do these elaborate property scenarios, and it would often be, to my beloved Michael for life, remainder to Peter, Emily, and so on and so forth. And then one day I met her beloved Michael, and then fortunately he hired me for my 2L job. So that all worked out very nicely. In terms of summers, I externed for Judge Henderson in the Northern District my first summer, and then I worked at this wonderful labor law firm where I ended up going after law school as an associate, and then ultimately partner, Altshuler Berzon, and had a fantastic litigation experience there. In terms of activities in law school, I was the first class admitted under Prop 209, and so the diversity was a major issue then. I spent a fair amount of time in the registrar's office, not necessarily welcome, and there was a lot of student activism around that time, and I worked with a bunch of other students with the Berkeley Law Foundation to set up the Phoenix Fellowship, and so that I think has been ongoing, I hope, with the auctions, so that the energy around that, and as I mentioned at the start, going to a public law school was really important to me because I believe in access to justice. And a public law school, in theory, should embody those values. And it was really important for me and many of my classmates to try to reclaim that aspect of Berkeley law. So I think that was some of the animating events of my law school career.
Yeah, that fellowship is continuing, and the Berkeley Law Foundation also funds a postgrad fellow. So for all of our panelists, let's get into the clerkship nitty-gritty. Why did you want to pursue a clerkship? And in each of your cases, why more than one? Professor Kerr?
I loved law school. It's a good experience to have if you want to become a professor. I was in the law school classroom thinking, this is really cool. What makes law incredible is that its ideas and its concepts and its theory and its practice and its actual exercises of power by government officials that has to be explained. And so I just found that incredibly interesting, and I wanted to see it done. What really makes clerkships an extraordinary experience is that you're right out of law school, or maybe a year or two out of law school, and you are there in the judges' chambers or in the justices' chambers trying to figure out how the cases should be decided with the judge. A lot of judges, justices will ask the clerk to come up with an initial view as to what should happen in the case, and then you argue your case to the judge as to what you think should happen, and the judge responds. You have a debate going back and forth as to what the right answer should be. So you're almost like an assistant judge, a deputy judge. You have no actual power, but you kind of are considered that way by the judge or justice. And so to be able to be a part of that is really just amazing. And you learn so much about how judges decide cases after you've been a clerk. You look at pending cases and you can be like, yeah, they're going to affirm that, or nah, they're not going to agree with that. You kind of get an instinct as to the individuals, you get an instinct as to the ideas, and you just have a much deeper, richer understanding of law than you did beforehand. So I applied for a Court of Appeals clerkship when I was in law school, and was a law clerk for Judge Leonard Garth on the Third Circuit, just outside New York City in New Jersey, and it was an incredible experience. I didn't plan on clerking after that, but I applied once, got one interview, and thought, well, why don't I just apply again, just on a lark? And I didn't get any interviews. I thought, whatever, that's fine. Ended up getting a phone call from someone saying, hey, I'm a former law clerk for Justice Kennedy. I want to interview you. And I didn't actually know what this was about because I was doing a bunch of media interviews about other topics at the time. So I was like, yeah, sure, happy to do an interview. And then it dawned on me about 10 minutes into the conversation that this was a clerkship interview, because of those clerkship interviews application I'd filled out 11 months earlier. I was like, oh yeah, I applied for that. Oh wow. And then the interviews were, very much like a Socratic dialogue in a law school classroom. And having been a professor for 2 years at that point, I was particularly well equipped for that. I was like, this is fun and easy. And so it was not something I'd really planned, but it ended up being, it's just incredible. I now have the very odd experience of teaching certain opinions that I helped write. And it actually makes it a lot harder to teach those opinions, because you want to be like, no, here's what was really happening. And you can't. You have law clerk confidentiality requirements. So, when I ask the question, so what do you think of Justice Kennedy's opinion? I have to make sure I don't, express sadness if they say, yeah, this doesn't make any sense at all. Maintain some objectivity. But you get to see things in law that you'd never otherwise get to see unless you're the judge, and you see them like right out of law school. It's amazing.
I think similarly, I was wanting the intellectual challenge and the intellectual training. It is amazing intellectual training. I knew I wanted to be a litigator, and it is the best experience you will get in 1 year. It's like 10 years worth of experience. It's an amazing privilege to sit at the feet of a master and really get that bird's eye view and internal understanding into the judicial decision-making process. You also get exposed very early on in your career to a huge range of litigation, which is extremely beneficial for many reasons. One, it will help your self-confidence, because you will be like, I can do better than that. And two, it will show you what works and what doesn't. You will just see a kind of volume of litigation that you won't otherwise if you're just, an associate at a firm. So it's a wonderful, intensive crash course very early on in your career, and it will really give you a very solid underpinning. And if you're lucky, you have a judge that really believes in a sort of a mentorship, pedagogical relationship. That was one thing. I'm sure we'll talk about this later. But like, what are you looking for in a clerkship? And having a judge. If you can pick or choose, having a judge who's really committed to teaching his or her law clerks, I think, is a real bonus. And I was very, very fortunate that way.
I echo everything they both said. I guess one thing I would just note is I don't know that clerking is for everybody or every job that you want to pursue after law school. It's not like a necessary check. So the example that often comes to mind was Barack Obama very famously sort of was offered a DC Circuit clerkship after he graduated from Harvard Law School, and he turned it down because he wanted to go do community organizing in Chicago and start working on it. So I think there's a lot of jobs that a lot of career paths you may want to pursue that it doesn't necessarily inform, but I had thought of either being a law professor or potentially a litigator, and for both of those, as well as a number of others, it's hard to overstate just how valuable clerking can be. So echo both of what they said.
Great, thank you. And what goes into a successful clerkship strategy? What do you need to put forward? What kind of advocates do you need to get in your corner for that? And we'll start with Ian.
I think number one is just like trying to enjoy law school and excel. I think the more you enjoy law school, probably the more you will excel in law school. So that's helpful. Finding professors to sort of be supporters and sort of mentors in that process can really pay dividends. I would say my DC Circuit clerkship was actually a direct result of one of my property law professor here, Eric Bieber. My wife was doing a master's in DC, and I was looking for a one-year job in DC, and he was able to call up Judge Rogers, who wasn't really looking for clerks at the time, but was just able to. I was going to be in DC, and he called her up and said, I have a student who's going to be in town who you should really interview and consider. And so that was just sort of a direct result of that. My sense is, even I would say when I was here, Eric Stern, who just left, I think he's the head of the Career Development Office, was just getting underway in establishing a real strong support network for students interested in clerking at the school. And I've stayed involved as an alum now, doing things like this and talking to students who are applying. My impression is it has just really continued to grow and balloon, and folks like, Professor Kerr and Anna, and it just really, I've been really impressed to see how the school has really rallied behind this as an opportunity for its students, and it brings judges in every year to meet with the students. And so I think those, doing well in school, finding people to support you, of which my sense is Berkeley Law has a very strong, structure for that right now, are probably the two most important things in my mind.
Anything to add?
Sure. I think, obviously strong grades are super helpful, but if you are interested and you feel like you're not, don't have those grades, don't despair. Please don't despair. There are all kinds of other ways to get really exciting clerkships. So grades are helpful, but they're not dispositive. I think other things that are helpful are certainly good letters of recommendation, so strong supporters, whether that's from a law professor or someone you worked with really closely over the summer who can write a letter. I think it's much more valuable to have a letter from a practitioner that the judge doesn't know, that's very thoughtful and careful and clearly shows that the letter writer knows you and knows your work, than a very generic letter that doesn't say much from a famous professor. So letters of recommendation, grades, and writing sample. Think about getting a good writing sample that you can use, not the canned 1L memo. Hopefully your summer job can deal with attorney-client work product issues to let you have a writing sample that you can use as a judge. It needs to be about the right, kind of length. That's not going to, a law review note is probably not what they're looking to read, but more a kind of IRAC type situation, but again, not too canned. So I think those three things are helpful. And then I would also think about your, the strategy you have in applying. Really think about district court versus court of appeal, why, and have an understanding of why you're applying to which. Geographic spread, be open to judges wherever they are in the country. It's 1 year, you can move. I know I love the weather here too, but there are all kinds of other wonderful places to live. And again, it's just 1 year. And so, be broad and open-minded about your search and go for the judge that's a good fit for you, and not just the court or the location, the city, or the prestige value of the judge.
Absolutely. I mean, I advise students all the time to apply as broadly as they're willing to go, both to maximize their chances, but also there are hidden gems of judges everywhere across the country and across different courts. Let's jump into a little bit about the SCOTUS application process and your clerkship experience. When did you start thinking, I might want to clerk for the Supreme Court, and how did you go about applying? Professor Kerr, it sounds like you were already working and as a professor when you applied.
Yeah, so there's sort of two parts of it. One was when did I start thinking, wow, it'd be cool to be a Supreme Court clerk? And I suppose that's like around the time I arrived at law school, and I was like, wow, that sounds like a really cool job. I had a couple professors who'd been law clerks at the Supreme Court, and they talked about it. I was like, well, that just seems like a really cool thing. And so that sort of looking at that as a cool job to have is like the easy part. I just didn't expect that to happen. My first year grades were okay, but not great. Wasn't on law review at the law school that I attended, and so it just wasn't thought to be. I didn't think of it as like a realistic prospect. And then things years later, my grades had gotten better, and I clerked for a first judge and was a prosecutor at the Justice Department for a few years, and then a teacher, a professor at a school in D.C. for 2 years, and. Actually, what led me to apply the time when I did get the job was I had a friend of mine from years earlier who was a law clerk to one of the justices. She was a law clerk to Justice Thomas, and she was like, oh, I'll just bring in your application. Like, literally, I can hand it to the justice. And I was like, okay, well, that seems like a pretty cool, advantage, like actually like hand-delivered application. I suppose I should do it. And the application is just, a cover letter and a resume and a writing sample. And it's not a complicated application. And so that's actually what led me to do it. And then as soon as I handed her the packet, my friend, the packet to give to Justice Thomas, the next day she said, oh yeah, actually he hired all those slots, sorry about that. And so that's why I just sort of put it completely out of my mind. I was like, nothing's gonna happen. And so the application is not complicated. It's more, I think, a question of developing relationships with professors or others to recommend you. By the time you're at the point of applying to the Supreme Court, typically the way it works these days is you'll have probably not just one, but two prior clerkships by the time someone is applying to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's much more of a procedure than there used to be, but it's really a matter of sort of setting those things up. The actual application is not complicated.
Anything else to add?
I think this is really old, right? You see this number here. So I think my experience is very different. And I don't know that it's just in terms of like the timing. And, I got my Supreme Court clerkship my third year in law school. I just don't think that really happens anymore. But the first time it really occurred to me that that might be an option, honestly, was when I was applying for my first clerkship my second year. And I know the timelines have all changed about when people do things, but at least back in the day, for my first clerkship, I applied in like January of my second year. And I started to do well. And so there were some professors who were circling around me saying, you should think about applying for a Supreme Court clerkship. And I hadn't really thought about it before then.
And so what does a Supreme Court clerk actually do? In what ways was it the same or different from your appellate clerkships? Ian?
So I think Professor Kerr already described a little bit of just like the typical clerk job is you're behind the scenes and you're helping the judge in sort of whatever it is they're doing. They're preparing for oral argument. You're sort of prepping them by reading all the briefs and usually preparing a memo, sort of suggesting how you think the case should come out or the kinds of questions they should be asking. After argument they've held argument, there's an opinion to be drafted or a majority opinion or dissent or concurrence, and usually work with the judge on doing a first draft and then helping them edit the final product. All of those also apply at the Supreme Court, but there's the added wrinkle of the Supreme Court deciding which cases it wants to take. So a big part, and because so many requests come in, petitions for certiorari review, that the justices rely pretty heavily on the law clerks to do the initial sorting and sifting of those and preparing a memo that actually, although the practice, I'm not up to speed on the exact practice at the moment, but a pool of justices sort of put their law clerks together, and the law clerks write memos that go to, I think it's 7 or 8 of the 9 justices now. So that's a big part of the work that is different. There's also, I guess, there's probably fewer opinions to write at the Supreme Court than there are at a lot of Court of Appeals. And then, there's also just the element of, I'll speak to clerking for Justice Kagan. One of the very interesting things about clerking for her when I did was she was very new on the bench, and she had never been a judge before. She wasn't a lower court judge. So she was still sort of figuring out herself what kind of a judge or justice she wanted to be. And so we would spend a lot of time talking at lunch about, well, what do you think? When should I write it? Should I write a concurrence in this case? Should I not? Should I, or should be invited to give a speech? Should I give this public speech or not? What topic should I address in this speech? So there was a lot of sort of, give and take that we were able to sort of help her brainstorm the kind of justice she would want to become. And then she would have us help her with a lot of those things too. So some of us would help draft, a speech that she would give at a certain function or other. So those are some of the things. The last thing I would just say is I think, especially at the Supreme Court, where it's not just one judge like on a district court or a panel of 3 judges like the Court of Appeals, but every case that's heard, you typically have sort of 9 justices hearing it. So a lot of, and certainly for Justice Kagan, a lot of the way she approached the cases is not just what do I think the answer should be, but what is everybody else in the building thinking, and how can we try to get to a vote of 5, and are there compromises to be made? And so a lot of the work, more so than in my other clerkships, was wanting you to kind of go, talk to your colleagues in the other chambers and try to get a sense of, what other justices were thinking and sort of where the momentum was headed, and to help her strategize how that might change her approach heading into oral argument and the kinds of questions she might want to ask. So that was, again, some of the earlier comments, that's like the amount of I was able to learn and glean from that is hard to overstate. It was like years of experience in terms of strategic thinking and litigating and all that sort of stuff, condensed into 11 and a half months or whatever the clerkship was.
And what impact would you say your clerkships have had on your career and your practice? Are there specific examples where it's been especially beneficial? Professor Kerr?
So I was a law professor for 2 years before I clerked at the Supreme Court, and then 20 years since. And my view of the law changed. I actually had a law review article that I'd written my 2nd year as a professor that was undergoing edits while I was a law clerk. And I kept sending them new drafts because I realized I was saying things that made no sense. I was saying things like, well, the Supreme Court resolved this issue in footnote 12 in the 1977 case of Smith versus Jones. And once I was at the Supreme Court, I was like, no one's going to care about that footnote. Just no one cares. That was not, it was dicta. That is not sort of the core of the case. And they're not going to go along with that. And so I started having to rethink what the law was based on what seemed to me to be a more accurate understanding of how the Supreme Court decides cases, how they approach precedents, what's possible, what's not possible. And as an academic, actually, that may have been a little bit of a mixed bag because there were a lot of really cool arguments I could have made when I didn't understand how these things worked that might have been neat academic arguments that today I look at and I go, yeah, that'll never fly. No point in making that argument. That's never going to happen. So I think it's probably made the work that came afterwards more, it's had a greater impact on courts, or it has a better judicial audience because I have just a better understanding of how judges think. But maybe just there's, as you might find when you get in law school, there's a lot of law professors are kind of off in their world, theorizing about the universe. And maybe it would have been better for my academic career if I'd kept doing that rather than understanding how the world actually worked. But that's the trade-off.
I'll say for me that when I applied for my clerkships, it was really important to me at the time that I not do it based on the credential value, that I wanted to do it based on the experiential and the learning value and how it would make me a better lawyer. And absolutely, I did get that. But I will also say now, with 20 plus years of retrospective experience, that the credential value has helped me and it has been beneficial. I'm currently the general counsel of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and I was hired with no environmental experience whatsoever. Yes, I acknowledge. Okay, no whatsoever. I had 2 or 3 cases, one for NRDC actually. I will say that I work hard. I can pick up things fast. And I was very candid in my interview. I said that 50 times. I have no environmental experience, right? You see that on the resume. I don't think they would have given me the benefit of the doubt. So.
Yeah, I don't want to be naive about the credentialing thing. I'm sure that has played a role. But in terms of what the experience gives you as a litigator, a lot of the work that I have done, especially in the environmental field, I've practiced a lot in the Ninth Circuit and the DC Circuit. Those are probably the two courts of appeals that are the most important to environmental law. And as Professor Kerr was sort of describing before, it's like I know, and the courts have changed a little bit in the last 10 years, but I know a lot of the judges on that court. I know how those courts approach questions, and I've been able to, I think it's not only drastically improved my litigation, but I've been able to share that with my colleagues who have cases in those courts, and I'm able to sort of be a resource for them. And then, I would give, this is just general advice that I would give to any law student anywhere is sort of, the word networking is not one I would, that I love, but it's more just sort of be aware early on of the community of people that will sort of be a part of your career moving forward. And I guarantee you that some of you sitting in this room, even if you go to other law schools, you will end up crossing paths with each other in your career at some point. Guaranteed, two of you in this room will work together on a case in your future. So that's just something to keep in mind, I think, no matter what, throughout law school, when you're at admit weekends, get to know people, keep in touch, remember them, because you will cross paths again. There's an element to clerking that, this is a downside sort of too in the ways that sort of it creates these little kind of hubs of sort of people in the know or whatever, but it can create a real incredible community of people. So there are, the deputy director of the career development office here is the wife of one of my co-clerks on the DC Circuit, and we've stayed friends forever. One of the attorneys at the California Attorney General office, who's a alum of this school, who's sort of the top climate attorney for the state of California, had clerked for Judge Fletcher the year before I did, and we've been dear friends for 12 years now, and now we work together on some of the most important environmental cases, I think, that are pending in the country. And the folks that I clerked with at the Supreme Court, not only in my own chambers, but the other chambers, there's still a community. One of the Sotomayor clerks from my term was just nominated to a judgeship the district court judge in DC. And so the clerks from all of the different chambers, despite their ideological differences, have sort of rallied together to support her in her nomination. And we rely on each other for moot courts. So, if I have a argument coming up in whatever court it is, and once I find out who my panel of judges is, I'll sort of go through that community of people and find, oh, this person I clerked with also clerked for that judge, and I'll have them moot me for my argument. So it's kind of hard to overstate how valuable it can be, especially to a litigation practice. And then I know I'm talking too much, but the last thing I'll just say is a lot of what I do in my current role at NRDC is trying to help the environmental community sort of figure out how to adapt to the changes that we're seeing in the judiciary. And the insight that I've been able to pull from my experience at the Supreme Court and at the DC Circuit, where some of those judges are now Supreme Court justices, is just, again, impossible to overstate how much insight it has given me and my ability, and other folks like me who are at sister organizations who are doing something similar. It just allows us to have a greater insight into, as Professor Kerr was putting it, what would actually fly there or what wouldn't, and what's sort of motivating the justices. So it's it's pretty front and center in my day-to-day work, for better or for worse. On this point, for worse, unfortunately.
Thank you. And Linda, we kind of glided over this. You were a judge before you were in your current position. What was it like being on that side of the bench?
So I was a Superior Court judge in Contra Costa, and it was an amazing privilege, amazing opportunity. It was very different from my prior practice. I had been a labor lawyer for about 9 years, and I was a civil rights lawyer at the ACLU for 8. And a lot of my practice was in federal court. I was doing sort of impact litigation, arbitrations when I was at a labor lawyer, but I didn't have, I wasn't in the sort of trenches and really enmeshed in the state court system and the many, many ways in which it has a profound impact on ordinary people's lives. I was in family court, I was in criminal court, and it was definitely eye-opening. huge volume, again, I was just, was unlike the prior, my prior practice areas, but it was, you know, it was definitely, this is, you know, you need to be the neutral decision maker. And it was, I mean, for the most part, it was there, in criminal court, it's very clear, you know, for arraignments, there's nothing, there's not really discretion. There's, you know, there's a lot of seat of the pants thinking when you're in trial. State court, again, is fascinating compared to my prior federal practice. I would have, like, be assigned a trial in the morning and in limine motions, oh, here are 30 from the prosecution and 30 from the defense, and decide them in the next hour on the record. Don't talk too much because we don't want to tire out the court reporter. The jury's waiting, bring them in. So again, it was a totally different experience, but it was a crash course, and really important to see what the reality is of our court system and the ways in which we are compelled to serve the public, and the ways in which we could certainly benefit from additional resources in serving the public better. But we still need to do what we can, because at the end of the day, we are responsible for serving justice. So it was an honor and a privilege. And I'm also glad to be on this side of it.
Thank you so much. And before we turn it over to questions from the audience, so start thinking about what you might want to ask, what advice do you have for these students as they make their law school decisions? Professor Kerr?
That's a big one. So I'm going to offer two broad thoughts. One is, you probably, in looking at different law schools, just have a fit feeling. Like, this place seems like home to you, or this place seems weird to you. And I think those feelings actually are pretty important. Different jobs I've had, different schools I've gone to, different schools I've taught at, I just sort of had like a feeling, and it turns out like a lot of times, whatever that is, that sense is relatively reliable. You're going to have a great experience at any law school you go to, but I think don't discount that kind of instinctive feeling you have. The other question that I think comes up a lot when you're in the situation you're in is like, how should you think about, you know, U.S. News rank, or sort of how prestigious a school is, and how does that factor in? To my mind, from your perspective, the key question is really just sort of, you can get to any place from anywhere. It's just a question of how easy it is to do. And so the sort of generally speaking, the benefit of a higher ranked school, and rank isn't like today's U.S. News ranking, it's sort of, I don't know, the last 20 years or so average, something like that, sort of overall reputation. The benefit of that is that you kind of don't have to stand out as much the higher up you go. And so someone who is, you know, if you're sort of picking among schools, it's not that any one school is like the place you go for X. It's just that that's going to be sort of an easier path versus a less easy path. So I think it all has to be, you know, what we lawyers would call a totality of the circumstances inquiry. You look at all the factors: fit, money, rank, feeling. Do you like the weather? Do you like the people? How does it seem? And make a call as to what's best for you. And whatever decision you make will be the right one, because ultimately this is about your life, not someone else's.
Any other advice?
I think at hard decision junctures, it's often easy to look at it like, oh, I don't want to make the wrong decision, but there are just many right decisions, and they'll be right for different reasons.
All right, questions from the audience? Yes.
So I had a previous experience doing a judicial externship where I mostly just sat in the courtroom and saw the proceedings. I'm wondering how a clerkship is different from that externship opportunity, and how you would prepare differently.
Let me start that. So it's pretty different. So the big difference is that once someone is a law clerk, you know, they've graduated from law school and the judge has specifically hired them for that position. A lot of judges rely on clerks as kind of an assistant judge. There are some judges that basically say to the law clerk, write the opinion. Whatever you think is the right answer, write it, and as long as it's not terrible, I'll sign it. I didn't clerk for any of those judges like that. The judges I clerked for were like, let's do draft number 25 now. And I'm like, can't we just be like the clerks in the other chambers that do the you'll sign it thing? That'd be so much better. But a lot of judges rely very heavily on their law clerks. And so the externship is more kind of for the experience of the extern to kind of see what it's like. And the law clerk experience is very much to help the judge.
Yes.
I don't know what your personal experience is, but I'm a non-traditional student, so I'm older, I'm in my 30s. How much of a barrier, if at all, do you think that plays in doing any sort of clerking? In your experience, like your other clerks that you work with, or things like that?
I mean, it might depend on the judge, but I would not, in general, I would say don't think that would be a barrier at all. I would say that one of the other things you do as a law clerk is often help your judges hire other law clerks. So we've also sort of, I suspect, if your experience was similar to mine, seen kind of the hiring process from the other side. Some judges, I would say, especially some of the judges I worked for, like really value people with like actual life experience or experience in other kinds of fields, depending on the court they're in as well. So, like I'll say, like I was a journalist before I came to law school, and I think I've had at least one, if not more, of the judges I worked for, including another one I had interviewed with, sort of say like, we love hiring journalists because they know how to write, and we know they can turn around a first draft on deadline, and they're going to help me edit my opinions as well too. So I would not at all have you go into this process thinking that it was a barrier. If anything, it could be a strength. So.
Totally agree. I think it's an asset.
Yeah, I think it's a strength, and you can see it as a strength from the standpoint of, you're a judge trying to hire someone who's going to help you. You want someone with judgment. You want someone who's very smart, and you're to look to law school grades, for example, for that. But someone with life experience and judgment is going to be better at that job than someone without that. So, pre-law school experience can be a really big asset, and it's often something like when I'm writing a clerkship recommendation, I'll talk about that because often judges care.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys might not have the answers to this, but I know that clerking can be a very competitive process, and at Berkeley, I'm just wondering what kind of ratio of students are really wanting to clerk and getting a clerkship versus kind of not ending up with one.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I would say the students that I work with, I probably meet with about a third of each class before the end of their 2L year, but I would say about half of that, so like a sixth of the class actually applies by the end of 2L year. The window on clerking doesn't really close, so there are people who start meeting with me as 3Ls, there are people who start meeting with me as alums. So as far as kind of the number of people in the pool, I would say it's about a fifth or a sixth of the class initially, but it can certainly expand as people develop more interest in clerking. About 10 to 15% of each class clerks immediately after law school, but within that number, that's not counting the people who might clerk 1, 2, 3, or 4 years out. Yes.
Can
Oh,
I
sure.
I just want to add a couple of that too. I really want to underscore the point I made before, which is it was very important to me when I came here of this idea of this culture of sort of people supporting each other as opposed to competing with each other. And whenever I talk to people who are here, I always check in. Is that still how things are? And I consistently always hear that it is. I would say it extended to the clerkship process. So it was not the sense of I'm trying to get this judge and I know you are too, and we're going to compete with each other. It was I remember specific examples of people supporting each other in the process, and it was actually one of the law professors who encouraged me to do this. But I had some interviews and once I got the offer from Judge Fletcher, I took it and I had to decline those other interviews. And they were like, this one of your classmates really wants to clerk for that other judge, and we understand he has an interview as well. Maybe you could put in a good word. So when I declined the interview, I said, just so you know, my classmate is interviewing and he's fantastic for all the following reasons. We were working on law review together. And I think I'm not saying that to because I'm such a great person. It was the professors that encouraged me to do it. And I think it's just indicative of the culture that I experienced and that I hear continues to be here. And then the last thing I would just say too is, I don't know how those numbers compare to other schools, but at least when I was here, I think there are certain schools that like, it may be a greater percentage of people that are applying, or that there's like more of a push towards it. It may be that our numbers have caught up with those or whatever, but at least when I was here too, it really felt like there was an opportunity to kind of stand out in a way where if you really if it was something that you really wanted to do and you had the right kind of, ability, the faculty really rallied around you to help support you in that process. Like that, I benefited from that in a way that I don't know if I had gone to another law school where there were 20 other people applying for a Supreme Court clerkship. Like, I don't know that it would, I think I might have been one of only a couple or a few people who were doing that my year, and the school really went to bat for me in a way that they probably couldn't if there were 25 students all gunning for the Supreme Court that year.
Thanks. We'll take one more question. Yes.
So for those of you, I can't remember all of you worked with Supreme Court justices, what was the difference in working with the justices with shadow docket versus the regular docket? Because you don't have to write an opinion for shadow docket.
That didn't exist back in my day.
It's funny. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. When with the question of earlier of how did this clerking at the Supreme Court differ from clerking at the Court of Appeals, I actually thought about bringing it up. It existed when I was there, but we didn't call it the shadow docket yet. The name didn't come up for Professor Bode wrote his article a couple of years later. But it actually is one of the differences, that the emergency docket, as some people prefer to, so there's the Supreme Court's merits docket. I'm not going to presume everyone here knows what the shadow docket is. The Supreme Court merits docket are the cases where it considers whether to take up the case, it decides to take the case, it grants the petition for certiorari, it sets it for full briefing and an oral argument, and it does that in, the numbers are fluctuating, but between 60 and 75-ish cases a year. And it also has a docket of things that are emergencies, where people are asking the Supreme Court to jump into a case earlier and do something other than grant full review, have full merits briefing, and an oral argument.